All right, hello and welcome to Chapter 10 in FAM 254. This is on adolescence and emerging adulthood, physical and cognitive development. Now, on the PowerPoint slides that you have, they were broken into two files. As you can see, those are both really small. So I went ahead and just combined both of those into this one presentation just for simplicity's sake. And it will show you here in the presentation where Part 1 ends and Part 2 begins. So let's go ahead and start with the part one. All right, so kind of a snapshot of adolescence and emerging adulthood. To some extent, there is some age segregation that takes place within adolescence, not really too dissimilar from other age groups as well. Typically, you don't tend to find a lot of young adolescents hanging out with older adolescents. If you remember back when you were a freshman and you're looking at the seniors and you're like, oh man, they're a senior, they're so old and mature, and if you're young, what it would mean to date a junior or a senior, so you could go to the junior prom or senior prom early. There's that type of age segregation that takes place, or if you're older, high school, and you're dating a college person. Not that I necessarily recommend that, but those sorts of things are kind of a step up in terms of the social sphere. There's still economic dependence within adolescence, as well as to some extent even in emerging adulthood as well. Now, it used to be thought that adolescence lasted up until about the age of 25. What they've done is created basically a new category called emerging adulthood. That happens between the ages of about 18 to 25, somewhere in there, give and take, depending on who you're talking to and who you're reading. It's just kind of a new category, whereas, once a person hit 18, in a lot of ways they would be seen as independent back in the old days. Today, however, we're seeing a lot more dependence take place between the emerging adult and their parents, and so that's why rather than calling it a continuation of adolescence, because there are definitely differences between the two, there's still that dependence, and so they felt that it warranted a new category, and thus emerging adulthood was born. If you think about it, back in your adolescence, and maybe if you're in emerging adulthood now, you probably have some pretty strong opinions about social things that are going on around you in society. When I was in high school, the first Gulf War broke out, and this was something that deeply affected my generation, people who were in my age group. Everybody was afraid the draft was going to come back, and we didn't want to go to war, we didn't want to lose anybody or have anybody die, but at the same time we could kind of see the purpose behind it. But a lot of people had very strong opinions about this war and things that were going on within our society and within our culture. And, that really kind of starts in adolescence, where you're deeply affected by current events. You see things going on, and, you feel very passionate about it. For some adults that gets tempered. For others, that level of passion maintains and continues through adulthood. Just kind of depends, I think, on the level of the person being affected by it. So some of the things about emerging adulthood, there's still some identity exploration. It used to be, fairly unheard of. Once you picked a career, you'd kind of stick with it and move on. But we know, in college, it's not unheard of for people to switch career, major several times. And even now, into adulthood, it's not unheard of for adults to switch careers a couple of times as well, depending on what they're going through. And so emerging adulthood, there's still a lot more identity exploration going on. Personality is not as fixed as we thought it once was. Definitely instability there. Whether emerging adult chooses to go to college or whether they choose to go into the workforce, there's still a lot of instability. People moving, coming in and out of their lives. Even employment, economic instability as well, particularly in today's economy where, it may be difficult to find a job as an adolescent or emerging adult or even adult down the road. There's a self-focused perspective typically within emerging adulthood, so there really is trying to, this feeling of getting to know yourself, getting to know what you're about, doing things that are best for you during this stage of emerging adulthood. Feelings of in between, don't feel quite adult, don't feel like a teenager or child anymore. Some of this is going to depend on how parents act as well. I know that some parents, when their kids are away at college, the kid is very independent. The emerging adult is very independent. But as soon as they come back home for the summer or for a break, the parent wants to treat them, like an adolescent again, kind of take away some of that independence that they were used to. Obviously, that can cause some conflict between parents and their emerging adults. But all in all, emerging adulthood is seen as the age of possibilities. So there's so much you can do, so much you can explore. And I really think that this has been a good thing for people, for society, to have sort of this new category of age where it's seen as being okay to explore yourself, to take risks, to do different things, rather than be focused on the traditional, get a education, get a career, get married, get a family. It's now that's being elongated, which I think is good because people are going into things a lot more mature and a lot more stable and secure in who they feel they are and what they're all about, even though that's going to change over time still. But there are probably some underlying currents within yourself that are pretty stable, that are going to to continue on through emerging adulthood as well as adolescence. Now, I'm not saying that it's good to go, sow your seeds, as it were, and do a lot of crazy and stupid things that you might regret later. But definitely, taking risks. For those of you that are able to, do some study abroad stuff, get experience with, different parts of the culture, parts of the country, even parts of the world if possible. But if anything else, just really explore yourself and take advantage of the time. I think that is very healthy and very good, and something that I wish that was stressed more when I was entering into this phase. I was probably on the tail end of the, graduate from high school, get a job or get an education, and then get a career, and then move on. I don't regret anything. But I definitely think it's good for today's generations to be able to have that like time frame where they can really do a lot of self-focus and exploration of self. I'm off my soapbox again. So some of the things going on in adolescence, not going to spend too much time on these, but as we all know that adolescence is a time of puberty. So there's that physical growth, physical change that goes on. The male hormones, the androgens, particularly the most popular one is testosterone, starts to develop more in adolescence. And as a result, boys get body hair, the voice gets lower, and they also start to grow. Female hormones, the estrogen and progesterone, start to take a more prominent role. And so physical, females also start getting body hair, breasts develop, and then menstruation starts as well. I assume all of you have had that talk several times when you were in adolescence. So like I said, we're not going to spend too much time on this. But one of the key things I think that's important, whether you're going to be a parent of an adolescent or whether you're working with adolescents, is to be comfortable in talking about these different changes. I know a lot of parents, because they feel very conservative, have a hard time talking about these things with their kids, but it is definitely important to. And really, even at the age of 10, So even at the age of 10, then it's important to not necessarily go full in depth on things, but start giving them a heads up, because we're seeing kids younger and younger start experiencing these physical changes, and so it's important to, for example, if someone a girl who's 10 years old starts her period. There's also a potential then for her to also become pregnant, and so it's important to be able to help kids this age be aware of these changes. And to some extent, this is covered a little bit in school, but I think it's very helpful for parents, guardians, and again, those working with adolescents to be comfortable in talking about these things, just to help kids as they go through this, so it's not a huge scary transition. Okay, so in puberty then, some of the things that take place then, the sexual maturation, you can see there how it, some of the things that happen in men, and then some of the things that happen in women as well. This is not necessarily in chronological order. It's going to be different for each individual, although there are some sort of standard things that we look for. But again, just because somebody doesn't develop in a particular way doesn't necessarily mean they're abnormal. But it is something just to keep an eye on, that these things do happen at some point within their development. So with all of these physical changes then, there are potential concerns about body image that arise. Typically, when we talk about anorexia and bulimia, we think about young women or women, but this does happen with males as well. We just don't see it as frequently. Probably to some extent, part of that is because of the pressure that the media and society places on women. I remember a couple of Thanksgivings ago, we were deep frying our turkey safely outside with an electric fryer, not the propane thing. And as it was bubbling, my oldest daughter was out there, and she probably would have been 11 or 12 at the time. And she talked about how fattening that turkey was, and I about kicked over the table out of surprise, because I have no idea where that came from. We've never really talked about weight gain or fattening or being overweight or anything like that. It's been, hopefully, I think, more about accepting yourself and your body. And so we had to have a little conversation about, you have to eat healthy, but at the same time, you really need to accept who you are, and that includes accepting your body shape and size as well. Anorexia and bulimia are both very dangerous illnesses. People can definitely die from malnutrition and other complications as well. So anorexia typically is either reducing the amount of calories that one consumes per day, and honestly, this can go as low as 800, 900 calories per day, which is not a lot to get through. For a lot of people, that's just one meal. But it's either a reduction in calorie and or an increase in the amount of exercise, and I've actually seen it both ways. And usually with anorexia, no matter how, or bulimia really, no matter how thin the person is, they still see themselves as being overweight. Bulimia, we typically see the binge and purge behavior. So somebody might eat quite a bit of food, and then either they will cause themselves to throw it all back up, or they'll take a large amount of laxatives and it'll come out the other end. I personally hate throwing up, so it's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around a little bit for people that do it on purpose. For me, even though I know it'll make me feel better sometimes, I refuse to throw up because I hate the feeling. But typically people with bulimia appear to be not necessarily of healthy weight, but they don't look as thin as anorexia, and that's because a lot of the digestive process, or at least a good portion of the digestive process, has already happened within the mouth and before they can throw it up. So they're consuming more calories than people with anorexia. they're just getting rid of it differently. So anorexia, malnutrition is huge. Not getting the vitamins or the the calories that they need in order to sustain activity. And with bulimia, hopefully all of us know that the stomach acids coming out are not meant for the esophagus or the mouth, and so there can be a breakdown in teeth and even in within the tissue of the esophagus. So it's really not a pleasant thing. Along with the body image and adjustment, for boys, it's actually beneficial for them to be an early maturer. When they develop before their peers, they appear to be more masculine and more manly. And as a result, their peers tend to respect them more. And, strangely enough, their teachers do as well. They kind of fall into that as being seen more mature. And so they can receive more attention and, more favorable attention than those who are either on time or late maturers. For girls, because of our society, it's typically not good for them to be an early mature. They can be teased, feel self-conscious because their body is different. And again, this is not a sex thing. This is definitely a gender thing. This is the way that our society views women. And similarly, it's not good for, similar to males, it's not good for young women to be late matures either, because again, they're going to feel different from the rest of their peer group. So, for girls, just as normal as possible is going to be good. But for boys, definitely the earlier the better. So now we're going to move into part 2 of the PowerPoints that you have. However, still staying with the physical and cognitive development. Some things that have definitely happened that are going to impact the way that the physical development is going to be perceived within both boys and girls. Sexual practices has definitely changed throughout time, and really there's been kind of this it's almost like a pendulum that swings from real conservative to more liberal attitudes, and it keeps going back and forth and back and forth. So if we look at the 1940s, 1950s, it was very conservative. Then we've moved, into the 60s, 70s, and maybe even somewhat into the 80s, into a more liberal, free love type thing. And even into the 90s, I know that when I was in high school, the hippie movement was something that was greatly idealized. And so sexuality was a lot more prominent, a lot more liberal. We had Madonna singing, Express Yourself and grabbing herself on stage, which was very controversial. We had the Divinyls, One I Think About You, I Touch Myself song. And so even Right Said Fred, I'm Too Sexy, all kind of moved that pendulum as being toward the more liberal side, And then now we're seeing a swing back to being a little more conservative overall as society, but it wouldn't surprise me if we actually hit a peak already of conservative and moving back into more liberal attitudes towards sexuality, particularly as we see things like the GLBT movement moving forward, as well as more feminist thought becoming more prominent within our society. So there really is that back and forth, and we're still in more of a conservative setting, but again, my guess is that we're swinging back toward more liberal attitudes to an extent. So factors that influence then early sexual relationships, of course, the society context is going to play a role in it. How open to early sexuality a culture is. So ethnicity is going to play a role into it, because this gets down more on an individual level. And again, so this is going to be based more than just race, but also religion and culture and everything that we've talked about in terms of ethnicity. Family situation, how well the adolescent talks to their parents, or if that communication line is open, which again is, like I said earlier, parents really need to be comfortable being able to talk about these things with their kids in order to have that type of communication. Their peer attitudes definitely going to play into it as well. You know, if their peers are more sexually focused, then they're probably going to be as well. And it's not necessarily that their peers have influenced them in that direction, but more of sometimes peers are a self-selection process. So the teenager may already have those similar attitudes and just be picking a peer group that is, reflects their own attitudes and values. And then obviously their sexual maturity is going to come into play as well. So some kids at the beginning of puberty, think the idea of sex is absolutely gross and disgusting, and it's very repulsive. But as they become more mature and those hormones kick in, it becomes a lot more appealing. And so depending on where they are in terms of that maturation with their physical development is also going to play a role in whether or not they're going to engage in sexual relationships earlier in life as opposed to later. Okay, so some of the consequences of adolescent sexual behavior. STDs is a big one. I remember seeing a documentary not too long ago about some, I think it was just outside of Atlanta, in one of the suburbs. There was a huge outbreak of STDs within the adolescent population. I believe it was chlamydia. And the community was perplexed about how this was getting spread around so quickly. And what they discovered was that these parents were working, leaving the teenagers home, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but these teenagers were getting pay-per-view of different porn movies. And so teens were getting together in groups and watching these porn movies, then acting out what they had seen. And so as a result, the STDs just went through, this community and the adolescents like wildfire. And it's really not uncommon. I know in Lubbock, when I was doing my doctoral program, I remember hearing a statistic that Lubbock, community of about 100,000 people at the time, actually had one of the highest rates for teenage syphilis. In the United States, and so that was a huge eye opener as well. So STDs can be very common amongst adolescents, and we know there's no such thing as safe sex. There's just safer sex, and sometimes kids have access to those things, sometimes they don't. But it's definitely important to help them be aware of some of these consequences. Pregnancy is also a possibility. Of early adolescent sexual behavior, obviously. And again, no birth control is 100%. It can happen. And there are some effects of early parenting, definitely some economic impacts. Now, typically, this is going to be for the female, which is definitely unfortunate because it's not entirely her fault that she's pregnant. Sometimes may not be her fault at all. Yet a lot of the burden, a lot of the costs are placed on the female for going through the pregnancy, and so teen pregnant mothers typically have lower education. It makes it difficult to finish high school, let alone college, and so that's going to bring about a whole host of economic challenges for them. They've become a parent at an early age where they're really still trying to, develop an identity. And so as a result, some of their own personal development may be stunted while they're caring for the child. If they don't marry, they may live at home. Again, this is going to depend on parent-guardian attitude. If that's the case and their parents are supportive, it can definitely take a large burden off of the adolescents. But that's still just another factor that may be good, maybe negative, depending on the context. And then also with pregnancy, young parents, there's a higher incidence of child abuse. Raising a baby is not easy at any age, but when you're in a phase where you're naturally more egocentric, it might be a lot more difficult to control some of that temper, and as a result, it may be taken out on the infant or the child. And so we definitely see more incidents of child abuse amongst early parents. Some of the cognitive changes or the brain changes, physical changes that take place in adolescents' brains. So we know that the brain development continues through adolescence and into emerging adult. Again, a lot of this is really new information. We used to think that at some point the brain just became static and it is what it is, but we know that the brain is continually changing. And even in adolescence, there really is a lot of active things going on within the brain. For example, neural pruning. We talked about that in terms of it happening in childhood, but in adolescence it also is very pronounced. And so within that neural pruning, again, the brain is becoming more refined, and it's becoming it's able to process information a lot quicker now. Within the adolescent brain, with that neural pruning, then we see more white matter, which is allows that brain to function a lot more quickly. The pruning starts within the back of the brain, and then it tends to move forward. So I believe that even reflects brain development for fetuses as well. It all starts in the back and then moves forward. So it's really kind of reflecting that as well. And then with all of those hormones going through, we also know that sometimes emotional regulation within adolescence can be difficult as well. If you think back to your own adolescent, you can kind of maybe remember times where you were just happy as could be, then all of a sudden the next moment you were sad, depressed, or angry, and things changed like that. I remember when I was an adolescent, I attended the same middle school that my dad taught at, and I was eating lunch in his room because it was empty, and I had better food than what was offered in the cafeteria. And the secretary came on and said, "Trent, why weren't you in choir?" And I said, "I was in choir. I was there the whole period." And the secretary said, "Well, you weren't marked as being present." And I just lost it. I have no idea why. I just started crying. I was like sobbing, and I spent the rest of the day in my dad's back room, and as I was just getting over that wave of emotion of nothing was going to happen. They just contacted the teacher, who confirmed I was actually there. It was just a mistake in roll keeping. Although right after that burst of emotion, suddenly I thought about my dog that had just died, and so another wave of sadness came, and finally my mom had to come and check me out of school. Just one of those things with adolescence that your emotional regulation is definitely affected in there. And then stimulus seeking as well. That dopamine is a drug that makes us feel pretty darn good, and we can get that by thrill seeking, basically. And so as teenagers, we might do things that are kind of stupid, or not necessarily stupid, but a little more dangerous. I've bungee jumped a few times in my adolescence, just kind of get that rush, to get that dopamine flowing. So that's also, that happens throughout life. But as a person gets older and more mature and more experiences, some of these things are a little more tempered. But in adolescence, it's almost like when it comes out. I have a friend that calls it being hormotional in adolescence, where the teenagers just get really emotional at the drop of a hat. So that's kind of stuff does definitely happen. And then finally, along with those brain changes, obviously, it's going to affect the way that adolescents think. And so Piaget moves it into formal operations, and this is where we become more abstract thinkers. And so if you think about it, even in terms of math, all throughout elementary school, it's very concrete, right? 1 + 1, 2 × 2, you might get into fractions. But in early adolescence, you start getting into some algebra, pre-algebra, geometry, all of which is pretty abstract compared to what we were doing in elementary school. And that just reflects the capability that adolescents now have because of these brain changes that have taken place. You can start thinking about what things could be, and even though not a lot do it, and not a lot of adults do this, we do have the ability to plan and think ahead. Whether or not we use that is another issue. I remember my son several years ago, my oldest son, when he was in adolescence. Well, he still is, but when he was in earlier adolescence, he popped the question like, what if the way I see blue is different from the way that other people see blue? And I looked at him like, welcome to, the abstract world, and to, the more postmodern thought, where things aren't necessarily what we think they are. And it was just like a huge, like, mind-blowing thing for him. And maybe you can remember when you finally reached that point in your development where you started thinking, what if things are different and not what I'm people don't see things the way I see things. And that really kind of is a great introduction into, you're now in this formal operations. So what do adolescents think about? They examine the world and the family. Adolescents have a very strong hypocrite detector. They detect right away when somebody does not do what they say they're going to do, or they don't practice what they preach. Even though the adolescent might not as well, they're going to see that more in other people's. And part of the reason they're not going to see it in themselves is because of this adolescent egocentrism, where the world revolves around them. Some people grow out of this to some extent, other people don't. But for the most part, within adolescence, it is normal that why wouldn't people be interested in me, because I'm interested in me and I'm an interesting person. And so that's adolescent egocentrism, and that brings up a whole other host of things for them. And if you're interested in those things, in my when I do teach adolescent development course, FAM 357, we definitely go over a lot more of these things in depth. I think it's very fascinating and interesting to dive into the world of adolescence. So that is the end of this physical cognitive type thing that changes that take place in adolescence and early adulthood. And in the next presentation, we'll move into more of the social aspects of it.